For decades, there was this kind of unwritten promise in the American economy. If you work hard and help the country grow, you'll share in the rewards. But for so many people today, that promise feels, well, broken. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into a really simple, but honestly, a crucial question. What happened to shared prosperity? So let me ask you something. Does it ever feel like you're just running on a treadmill? You're putting in the hours, you're being more productive than ever, but your paycheck just isn't keeping up. Well, if you feel that way, you are definitely not alone. And as we're about to see, there's a very real, historical reason for this feeling.
You've probably heard that old saying, right? A rising tide lifts all boats. This idea that as the economy grows, everybody benefits. But there's a new joke that's kind of been going around and it reframes it. A rising tide lifts all yachts. And wow, that really captures the exact shift we're going to unpack here. The move from a broadly shared prosperity to a much more unequal kind of growth.
All right, so let's dive into this. To really get what went wrong, we've got to first look at what went right. For about 3 decades after World War II, the United States went through this period of just incredible economic expansion.
And this is the key, that growth was shared. It was spread out. As the country produced more, the vast majority of workers actually saw their paychecks get bigger. Hard work literally paid off. You could draw a straight line from the nation's economic health to your own family's financial health.
But then, that straight line started to break. Around the late 1970s, the whole economic engine just shifted gears. That promise of shared prosperity, it started to fade, and this massive gap began to open up.
And this brings us right to the heart of the mystery. It's what the Economic Policy Institute calls the productivity pay gap. Now, that sounds a little academic, but it's really just about this growing chasm between the value of what we all produce as a country and what most of us actually get paid for doing that work. And wow, the numbers here are just stark. This is really Exhibit A in our case. Since 1979, our productivity, the value we create for every hour we work, has shot up by over 90%. But the pay for a typical worker, it's only grown by 33%. So the big question is, where did all that extra value go? To figure that out, we have to jump in our time machine. Let's rewind the clock to the period before this gap even existed, that post-war boom. See, back then, the economy was playing by a totally different set of rules, a system that was really designed for stability and predictability above all else. Okay, so the cornerstone of this whole thing was a system called Bretton Woods. The easiest way to think about it is like a global financial rule book that was set up back in 1944. Its main job was to prevent the kind of economic chaos that led to the Great Depression and World War II. So here's how it worked, basically in 3 steps. First, other countries locked their currencies to the US dollar. Then, the US dollar itself was locked to gold at a fixed rate. And the result? A pretty stable and predictable system that basically anchored the entire global economy. And that brings us to 1971, and a moment so huge it's actually known as the Nixon Shock. This was the moment when it felt like the world's financial rulebook had its most important page just ripped clean out.
Now, this didn't just happen overnight. Throughout the 1960s, you had all this spending, which meant there were way more US dollars floating around the world than the US had gold to actually back them up. So by 1971, other countries started getting pretty nervous, and they began trading in their dollars for gold, which threatened to completely empty the US reserves. President Nixon saw a crisis coming, held a top-secret meeting at Camp David, and made a decision that would change everything.
So on August 15, 1971, Nixon gets on TV and tells the nation he has to do something. In his words, we must protect the dollar from the attacks of international money speculators. He really framed it as a defensive move, a necessary one to protect the American economy. And just like that, with one speech, Nixon single-handedly cut the dollar's link to gold. The anchor was gone. The Bretton Woods system was, for all intents and purposes, over. And that set the stage for a completely new economic era.
But see, the Nixon shock, it wasn't just about gold. It was a signal of a much deeper change in how people were thinking about the economy. With that old anchor gone, the old rules that had governed the post-war economy were about to get thrown out and replaced. And look, while big things like globalization and automation were definitely part of the story, the argument we're really digging into here is that this whole shift was driven by a brand new policy playbook.
So according to the Economic Policy Institute, that old post-war system, it was held up by a few key pillars. Yet policymakers actively trying to keep unemployment low. They regularly raised the minimum wage. They protected the right to unionize. Top tax rates were high, and regulations were generally pro-worker. All of these things worked together to help make sure that growth was shared.
Then, in the decades that followed, it's like each one of those pillars got dismantled, one by one. The new playbook? It was okay with higher unemployment if it meant fighting inflation. The minimum wage was basically left to wither on the vine. Union power was systematically weakened, top tax rates were slashed, and deregulations swept through almost every major industry. The rules of the game had completely, fundamentally changed.
Now, this didn't just happen in a vacuum. A really powerful intellectual movement was driving this shift. Thinkers like the economist F.A. Hayek argued that government control over money was the actual problem. He famously said he wanted to, and I'm quoting here, take the thing out of the hands of government by some sly roundabout way. And that really reflects this deep philosophical belief in free markets that became incredibly influential.
Okay, so now that we have this new economic rulebook in place, let's circle all the way back to our original mystery, that huge gap between how much we produce and how much we earn. Where did the money go?
Let's just look at these numbers again, because they are wild. Thanks to new technology and just plain old hard work, the value we create in each hour has grown by an incredible 90%. I mean, that is a massive increase in our national wealth.
But the slice of that pie that went to the typical worker, it only grew by 33%. So that leaves this huge chunk of what you could call missing income, at least from the perspective of the average American's paycheck. So where did it go? Well, here's the answer, at least according to the EPI's analysis. The money didn't just vanish, it was redirected. As you can see right here, the majority of that productivity growth flowed to two main places: higher corporate profits for shareholders and skyrocketing salaries for top executives and other very high-wage earners.
So what's the bottom line? The ultimate outcome of all these policy shifts, according to the Economic Policy Institute, is that our economic growth became both slower and more radically unequal than it was in that post-war era. So the economic pie grew more slowly, and most people ended up with a much smaller slice. And this all brings us to one last big question, because the rules that shape our economy, they aren't like gravity, right? They aren't forces of nature. They're the result of choices. They were intentionally changed once, and that led to this great decoupling of pay and productivity, which just leaves you wondering, if they were changed once, could they be changed again?